to talk about William Shakespeare, as people have been doing for centuries. We're marking his 450th birthday this year and celebrating the fact that his work has been read, performed, and admired throughout all those years. Shakespeare was, of course, a popular author in his lifetime. He wrote for the theatre, which was the closest thing Renaissance England had to a mass medium. His plays are subtle and rich in challenging thought, but they're also funny, touching, and most importantly, charged with an emotional power that speaks directly to any audience, anywhere in the world. And this, I will argue, more than anything else, is why his works are as globally popular and celebrated as they are today. The Guardian reported that a Moroccan interviewer once asked the British theatre critic, Lynn Gardner, to confirm that Shakespeare was an Arab. An Iraqi interviewer asked if she could be more exact. I mean, Shakespeare was born in Basra, wasn't he? Their tongues were, I suspect, in cheek, of course, but it's worth remembering that while Shakespeare was voted British Person of the Millennium by listeners of Radio 4's Today programme, several other countries have been willing to offer him citizenship. And as you've heard already today, his plays have been translated into over 90 languages. Now, I believe, as Helen said, the first of these languages, but I don't know when, was German. August Wilhelm Schlegel called him ganz unser, entirely ours, and there are records of German touring productions as early as the first decade of the 17th century. But it was in 1771 that Goethe proclaimed in a lecture in celebration of Shakespeare, and I quote, "Once I had read an entire play, I stood there like a blind man given the gift of sight by some miraculous healing touch." So, what better place than here in Berlin to talk about ways of ensuring that Shakespeare's reach continues to grow? There is still an enormous worldwide public who could learn from and be delighted by his work. And as a publisher, I'm keen to support any means which will keep his audience growing. Genius is an overused word, but it is the only word that measures up to Shakespeare's stature. The Romans used it to mean the spirit of a place, but Shakespeare can't be confined to one place. English nationalists have focused on the assumption that his birthday is April 23rd, which happens to be the day of England's patron saint, St. George. But that coincidence belittles Shakespeare. Shakespeare, long ago, grew too big a cultural phenomenon to be claimed by one nation alone. He is one of the handful of creators whose tremendous talent and universal appeal have made them global spirits. It is being proposed that he should be named as a laureate for Europe, but he was and is a writer for the whole world. Only recently, the actor Michael Wagg of the TNT Theatre Company was touring Macbeth to packed houses in China, and he reported one student in Hangzhou saying, "Shakespeare is not about nationalities. He's universal, about being human." And another said he was not just about our outer worlds, but our inner worlds, what's in our hearts. Which could be why, according to one critic recently, Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners read and reread Julius Caesar on Robben Island, and Abraham Lincoln turned to Macbeth as the truest portrait of tyranny, a theme I will return to. So we're brought together here today, fittingly enough, I think, by two institutions that bestride the world like Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. One, of course, is Bertelsmann, the global media company, and the only thing I'm going to say about myself is that I'm very proud to chair one of its associated companies, Penguin Random House. And the other, of course, is the British Council, which operates in over 100 countries around the world. It was set up in the 1930s to promote a wider appreciation of British culture abroad. And the British Council also has an anniversary in the UK, I believe, this year, its 80th. I think we're very lucky that Shakespeare wrote in English. It was not a given that our language should become the language of the world, but it was in part thanks to Shakespeare. And alongside his global cultural reach, I think we should also celebrate, and I'm sorry to say this, his economic impact on the UK, from tourism to the creative industries. Shakespeare is omnipresent. You can hardly speak English without quoting him. He added over 2,000 words to the language, not just evocative words like incarnadine, assassination, I'm not sure if that's evocative, sea change, lily-livered, aerial, bedazzled, but also everyday words like fashionable, mortifying, quarrelsome, reclusive, or even puke. Whatever we want to express, he's nearly always said it first and said it better. His phrases include break the ice, eaten out of house and home, kill with kindness, more in sorrow than in anger, green-eyed monster, the world's my oyster. Politicians steal his lines, writers quarry his plays for their titles. Hundreds of popular works have Shakespearean names, from Brave New World to Where Eagles Dare, from Terry Pratchett's Weird Sisters to David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. Half the world's children read Shakespeare in school. His plays are performed across the planet. Last year, 1.5 million people saw productions by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I once read a claim that a PhD thesis or a book is published about him every month. This year, over 40,000 British school children from 1,500 schools will get the chance to perform in a Shakespeare play in a professional theatre, thanks to the Shakespeare Schools Festival. Iconoclastic young companies are also constantly extending that audience, both with live performances and online. Here in Berlin, Thomas Ostermeyer's recent production played wonderfully dirty tricks on Hamlet, turning the court at Elsinore into a knockabout, terrifying mud bath. This was tragedy rethought for an era which loves to see its great stars publicly humiliated. Shakespeare is a key part of our heritage. His work is among the most precious legacies the past has handed down to us. But unlike most inherited goods, this heirloom is constantly evolving. Every generation finds something which seems almost uncannily modern. His wits and clowns use rhythm and rhyme, puns and innuendo, just as today's musicians do. Romeo's motor-mouth friend Mercutio was a rapper to rival Eminem or Jamie T for fluency. And now, the British rapper, Alcala's hip-hop Shakespeare Company, with their raucous musical versions of Richard II and Othello, are bringing Shakespeare to a whole new young audience, both in live venues and via YouTube. And I challenge you to watch Alcala's TED Talk and see if you can differentiate the Shakespearean lines from those of the rappers. I couldn't. The close relationship between the rhythms of modern hip-hop and Shakespearean iambic pentameter have fooled, I am told, many an academic audience. That said, most people know some of Shakespeare's lines, even if they don't know who actually wrote them. His lyrics are read aloud at funerals and weddings. His sonnets are quoted on Valentine's cards. He was even invoked, shockingly, by the British serviceman recently court-martialed for killing a prisoner in Afghanistan. As he pulled the trigger, the Marine quoted Hamlet, "Shuffle off this mortal coil." For better, or certainly for worse in this case, Shakespeare is lodged deep in our collective mind. And there is a reason for that. Shakespeare wanted his work to be accessible, and it is. In his day, theatre was popular entertainment. Books were obviously only for the literate, but everybody went to the playhouses. Yes, Shakespeare's language is rich and subtle, but you don't have to get every word to feel how each one serves the story. Shakespeare is a poet, but he is first and foremost a dramatist. He writes about family quarrels and power struggles, about jealousy, ambition, and grief. These are topics to which anyone can relate. And Shakespeare doesn't just tell us about these ideas, he brings them to the stage so forcibly that anyone in the audience, whatever their cultural background, as we've heard, can feel the impact of the dramatic punch he throws. Shakespeare doesn't stand still. Every era generates its own Shakespearean spin-off. Sir Tom Stoppard came to fame in 1966 with his brilliant variation on Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Shakespeare can inspire new plays, but he can also inspire new books. At Penguin Random House in the UK, I'm very excited that 5 of the world's best writers have already agreed to contribute, as you've heard, to the Hogarth Shakespeare. This series of novels will retell Shakespeare's plays and be published all over the world. The first of these will be published in 2016, the anniversary of Shakespeare's death. We will, of course, have The Merchant of Venice, reconceived by Howard Jacobson, who, of course, is going to be speaking to us later on this evening. I think that's an ideal pairing, a dream team. Shakespeare's disturbingly ambivalent play with its Jewish anti-hero was written before the term anti-Semitism existed. To have it examined by a great novelist who's made anti-Semitism one of his constant themes will be revelatory. And I think, Howard, you described the challenge as if you were a director hoping to reinterpret the original material for the modern ear. And you asked, can you tell the same story today when every reference carries a different charge? And I would say, yes, most definitely. And we're all very excited to read your book. Now, The Taming of the Shrew is also a play that cries out for another look. Its controversial account of a damaging relationship makes uncomfortable reading in a post-feminist age. Anne Tyler admits to, and I quote, disliking it intensely. We are therefore thrilled that she's agreed to take it on. Tyler is a wonderfully astute observer of modern marriages, and it will be a treat to see how she makes new sense of this story. Margaret Atwood and Jeanette Winterson are tackling The Tempest and The Winter's Tale, respectively. From each of them, we can confidently expect, to use another Shakespearean line, something rich and strange. And finally, our latest pairing, the best-selling thriller writer of the Norwegian Harry Hole novels, Jo Nesbø, has agreed to tackle Macbeth. He writes that what intrigues him is, and I quote, a main character who has the moral code and the corrupted mind, the personal strength and the emotional weakness, the ambition and the doubts to go either way. A thriller about the struggle for power, set both in a gloomy, stormy crime noir setting and in a dark, paranoid human mind. No, it doesn't feel too far from home. I will not attempt to do justice to William Shakespeare nor the story. I will simply take what I find of use and write my own story. One thing I think we can be sure of, Shakespeare would not have minded having his work used for inspiration in this way. I mean, after all, he copied most of his plots. He took his histories from Holinshed's Chronicles and stories in his Roman plays from Plutarch. His comedies are put together from traditional romances and stock theatrical situations. He was a snapper up of unconsidered trifles, and he knew how to make those trifles into a patchwork of magical beauty. What he did to others, others have been doing to him. For hundreds of years, artists, composers, filmmakers, and of course writers have been plundering his work for inspiration. We've had Shakespeare as opera, and there's a good reason why Verdi drew repeatedly on Shakespeare for his libretti. The plays combine beauty with terror, as grand opera does. We've had Shakespeare as ballet. Shakespeare's stagecraft is that of a choreographer. It's amazing how deftly and dramatically he moves his characters across the space. We've had Shakespeare's romantic comedy. The cinema loves Romeo and Juliet, a chance for beautiful young actors to fall rapturously in love. We've had Shakespeare's cinematic epic in Kurosawa's magnificent samurai versions of Lear and Macbeth. And in the BBC's brilliant animated Shakespeare, each play was condensed by Leon Garfield into 12 minutes, and we've had Shakespeare as cartoon. And now, in Touch Press's edition of the Sonnets, we have Shakespeare as an app. Shakespeare's best interpreters allow themselves as much freedom as he allowed himself. He used all the theatrical tricks available to him: light, colour, clowning, music played raucously on stage, or eerily drifting down from unseen performers in the gallery. Dance, ethereal fairy dances, the terrifying choreography of armies tramping into battle. He brings on ghosts, witches, monsters. In The Winter's Tale, he calls for a statue to come to life and left directors a challenge with the immortal stage direction, exit, pursued by a bear. Over the centuries, directors have added more and more machinery and more sensational theatrical events. In the 18th century, David Garrick played up the pageantry. The great Victorian actor-manager Henry Irving commissioned massive realist sets, Roman arches, crags and castles, and crowded the stage with extras in real armour. 20th century directors went the other way, staging the plays for maximum emotional impact on minimal sets. Today's directors have marvellous toys to play with: film projection, holograms, animatronics, sophisticated puppetry. They can use a huge variety of musical idioms, hard rock or electronic soundscapes, recorded orchestras, or live plainsong. But in using them, they are doing what Shakespeare did, and what good Shakespeareans have always done, hunting out the best up-to-date techniques to create a spectacle to match the richness of the drama. Shift the action to the present day? Of course you can. Lear, if he existed at all, lived in the 8th century BC. Cleopatra died in 30 BC. But Shakespeare brought all his characters, whether they were mythical Bronze Age warriors or politicians of the more recent past, onto the Elizabethan stage in contemporary dress and speaking the vernacular of his time. All of his plays, in whatever period they are supposedly set, describe the world he lived in. And because he had a way of finding the fundamental human core of any story, they describe our contemporary world just as well. Set Macbeth in Iraq, move The Winter's Tale to a hippie commune, and drop Romeo and Juliet into the warring gangs of New York. Set Hamlet in a locked psychiatric ward. All of these transpositions unlock new meaning from the plays. But none of these interpretations, though, can reduce the plays to on-message propaganda. Of all literary forms, drama is the most flexible and the most inclusive. In the best drama, and Shakespeare is the best, everyone on stage has a point of view. Drama isn't polemic, it's debate. Voices clash and contradict each other. Characters who initially appear charmless gradually lay claim to our sympathies. Over and over again, Shakespeare reminds us that those we don't like are human too. In Shakespeare's magnanimous vision, everyone has feelings, everyone has value. The plays are chameleons. They change their nature as each generation finds something new in them. Laurence Olivier's film of Henry V was made during World War II. Full of bright colour, flashing armour, and noble rhetoric, it was a cinematic hymn to patriotism. Now the play seems far more complicated. For audience to whom the Geneva Convention is an essential part of our shared mindset, the line which leaps out is Henry's terrible order given on the field of the Battle of Agincourt, that his men should kill all their prisoners. It was always there. Shakespeare knew about the dark side of warfare and acknowledged it 4 centuries ago. It's taken us that long to catch up with him and to hear that part of what he was saying. And recent reviews of King Lear, the brilliant Sam Mendes production, which I'm sure you will enjoy when you finally get to see it. I saw it last night. Starring, of course, Simon Russell Beale, talk of this early 17th century play illuminating 21st century concerns, such as the forthcoming Scottish referendum in the UK and issues of nationhood. And some plays sink from sight and then reappear as a new generation recognises something of itself in them. Timon of Athens was, for decades, one of the least popular of his plays. Then along came Nicholas Heitner's National Theatre production, and hey presto, we all saw that this ancient parable about the corrupting power of wealth had held a scarily truth-telling mirror up to our own age. Here were false friendships between sponsors and those who want their money. Here was dodgy credit. Here were reputations based on fraudulent claims of access or simply on smart PR. Here were lobbyists and false friends. Here were gifts, or do I mean bribes, all of it staged without any straining against the text in the glossy art galleries and office blocks of a modern city. You can play around with Shakespeare as much as you like. We imagine he wouldn't have minded. He wasn't precious about his work. He was open to suggestion. He subtitled Twelfth Night, or what you will. And yet, We know relatively little about Shakespeare, scraps of information, and perhaps that mystery also contributes to his enduring fame. It seems a safe bet that this great innovator, had he lived today, would have relished the challenge of creating a computer game in which a plot could take off in an infinite number of directions. Or you can play it straight. You can stage the plays as they are done at London's Globe Theatre in the visual style of their first performances, with musicians on a painted gallery and actors in ruffs and farthingales. Either way, these plays are indestructible. To paraphrase Shakespeare on Cleopatra, age cannot wither them, nor custom stale their infinite variety. Fashion in clothes or stage design change, and so does information technology. But Shakespeare saw deeper than that. The politics of power and sex, the fear of death, hate, anger, ambition, jealousy, despair, humour, and always the yearning for love. These are the constants of the human condition, and Shakespeare wrote about them all with an openness and a glorious insight which gives his plays still the shock of the true. Thank you very much.